Hi guys, it's Danny. Today we're going to discuss about how to treat sunburn on an orchid leaf. Now I did talk about this subject in past videos as well, but as one of my viewers pointed out, I never actually made a practical tutorial or at least a complete video about the subject. So today we're going to do just that. Since it's spring, our orchids are very prone to getting sunburns, so we'll start with what creates sunburns and how to avoid them, of course, but also we'll take some practical cases. And depending on the orchid and severity of the case, we're gonna see what to do about them. Alrighty, so as the name suggests, a sunburn or a heat burn is a visible damage on an orchid leaves which results into completely dead tissue. This damage occurs when the leaf of an orchid gets overheated. Sun alone is not enough to create this type of damage, but combined with high temperatures leads to a very high temperature on the surface of the leaf and inside the leaf. If the temperature is high enough, the tissue exposed actually dies. Now this damage is irreversible. Once a leaf has a sunburned spot or is sunburned altogether, there is no way to reverse the process. As the tissue affected is not sick, it is actually dead. Now sunburns can appear a little different depending on the orchid. The most common visual sign is a dry patch on a leaf, but sometimes it can look like a black patch and also a sort of purple reddish patch. And many of the times it can be surrounded by a black lining. All orchids can be affected by sunburn, even highlight orchids, because it is not necessarily a direct response to sun, but it is a response to very hot leaves. So, as I was saying, an orchid placed in direct sunshine is prone to being sunburned, but it will not get sunburned all the time because other parameters need to favor sunburn. Orchids and plants in general are capable to protect themselves against high leaf temperatures and also against UV rays, but not all species can protect themselves the same. Some orchids are more prone to being sunburned, such as the Phalaenopsis orchid, while others can tolerate higher leaf temperatures, such as the Vandas. This being said, an orchid which is not slowly getting adjusted to the quantity of light and leaf temperature can get sunburned no matter what. And usually sunburns are very frequent in the spring because in the wintertime orchids do not produce the same quantity of the chemical which protects them against heat, and sometimes it just so happens that when spring strikes, also the non-overcast days start as well. So the switch from winter to spring can be very abrupt in some climates and in some territories. If you feel they are pretty hot to the touch, definitely you should remove the orchid from its location, pick a shadier location, and then if you want to introduce it to more sun, do so gradually. Leave it in a certain position for a few days and then move it closer and closer gradually to the window where it will receive more sun and for longer hours. Alrighty, so now that we know what sunburns are and how we can avoid them, let's see how we can treat them. So here I have an orchid with minimal sunburn. As I was telling you, the sunburn can look quite dark, or if it's extensive enough, it can go directly to being dry. Now in this case, the damage is right at the tip of the leaf. The black spot is where the tissue is actually dead, but the affected part is quite extended. You can see I have some yellowing on the very tip, but this particular leaf is not completely dead. Everything green is quite functional. So in this case, we have two options. We can either leave the damage be and let the leaf function normally, or since the damage is not very extensive, but definitely looks unsightly, we can cut it off. Now, before we think of cutting any damaged portion, we need to think about the orchid. If we're dealing with a bushy orchid with quite a nice and numerous leaf display, it is absolutely fine to cut a portion of one of the leaves, because the other leaves will photosynthesize and the orchid will get food. But if we're dealing with an orchid which doesn't have too many leaves or is already struggling or recovering, it is best to leave the leaf alone. I know the damage can be unsightly, but for the well-being of the orchid, the leaf must be as complete as possible. As the orchid grows and produces more leaves, we can start thinking about cutting the damaged leaf. So in this example, I have an orchid with quite a few leaves. It is also a sympodial orchid. It has canes. I'm pretty safe to cut away this damage. So before we cut the damage, we need to make sure that our pair of pruners or scissors is well sterilized, particularly if we use it on other plants or other orchids. Unsterilized tools can spread disease, and particularly when we touch sap with the scissors, many diseases can pass through a healthy orchid. The way I sterilize my scissors is I let it soak in 96% alcohol and then I flame it. Some people use bleach, some people use simply alcohol, and other people really torch their sterilizing tools. So the option is yours. So what we'll do now is cut away the affected portion of the leaf. Now, since this is not an infection, it is a sunburn, we don't need to cut into good tissue. We're not trying to prevent the spreading of a disease. So we can cut as close to the wound as possible. Now, I like to cut at an angle because it just makes things look a little bit more natural. So what I'm gonna do is cut away at an angle the portion that is affected with a clean cut, like so. Now, the problem with an open cut is that it's a gateway for fungi and bacteria to re-enter the orchid. The way that I like to make sure that the orchid will not suffer reinfection is by using cinnamon. And this is ground cinnamon. You can find it at any supermarket. Some say it has some antifungal or antibacterial properties, but honestly, the only reason I use it is because it dries very well. It dehydrates. And once the tissue is completely dry, it cannot get infected. Bacteria and fungi are parasites and they thrive on live things. If the portion of the tissue is dry, it has a dead layer, infection of that layer is not possible because the parasites would have nothing to feed on. So what I do is take a little bit of cinnamon and apply it directly on the cut wound. Now, you can definitely use a Q-tip. I'm gonna use my finger, which is clean. So I'm just gonna dab the cinnamon directly on the cut wound. Being that the wound is wet, we expose the sap, the cinnamon will just stick to this wound and it will dry off a superficial layer which will act as a seal between the good tissue of the leaf and the exterior world and potential pathogens. Doing a statistic, in my experience, I had quite a lot of issues with reinfection of cut wounds, so I prefer to cut leaves as less as possible. I don't visually mind a little bit of damage, but I decided to cut this leaf just for demonstration purposes because I can see how some people can get really annoyed by these ugly spots. And we're pretty much done. We can continue to care for the orchid normally and of course try to avoid further sunburn. So the case we saw before was a pretty mild case of sunburn. I only had one little portion of the leaf being affected and there was really no issue in me cutting the tip of the leaf. But there are cases in which sunburns can occur further down the leaf. For example, in this case. Now, in this particular case, if I would like to remove this portion which is burned, I would have to cut away quite a bit of the leaf. If my orchid didn't have enough leaves or it would be recovering, I would definitely leave the leaf alone. As long as the damage is not infected and spreading, which is a pretty rare case, but it can happen, there's really no point in me cutting the leaf other than it bothers me. But since the main goal is to make the orchid healthy again, I need all the quantity of leaf I can have. Because this portion of the leaf is still perfectly functional. It photosynthesizes and it offers food to the entire orchid. So you can see how cutting away the damage of a leaf can be a serious issue for recovering orchids. In my case, this orchid has quite a lot of leaves, so if I would like to, I can definitely cut away this leaf on top of the damage. But as I was saying, at the moment, this doesn't really bother me and it serves as material for videos. I also have another portion that is burned here, you can see, and in this instance, again, I would have to cut away almost all the leaf. And it's simply not worth it because this is a perfectly functional leaf. Other than this particular spot, I'm not bothered by it, so I can leave it be. So as I was saying, infections due to sunburns are sometimes quite rare, but it doesn't mean they cannot happen. For them to happen, you would need to have exposed good tissue. But if the tissue is completely damaged and burned and dry, there is no way the spot can ever get infected. What can get infected is the area around it. Now, this spot has been on my orchid for around a year now. It did not get infected, so it poses absolutely no danger for the orchid. But if at any point in time this black area starts to spread and pretty fast from one day to another, I would definitely go ahead and cut the leaf because the infection can spread to the stem and eventually the entire orchid. And that obviously can pose a serious threat to my orchid. But if the sunburns are not infected, they absolutely pose no threat to the orchid. It's just a patch of dry tissue. But sunburn can be quite extensive and eventually it can kill an orchid if it's not strong enough. Now, I don't have a case at the moment, but last summer I had a severely burned Phalaenopsis orchid, and I'll just show you the images on the screen right now. Now, in that case, we couldn't really do much about it because the leaf was burned to such an extent that cutting any portion of it would not help. All the leaf was seriously affected, so in the end what happened was the leaf completely dried off, and most of the leaves did. The result was less food for the entire orchid, so she was seriously set back. But this wasn't enough to kill it because it had a good root system. And this is how the orchid looks today. We can see that the foliage is not quite big. It is still a recovering orchid. If the orchid loses enough leaves, 1 year might not be enough for her to re-establish. But starting from the second year, things should be a lot better. So if you have a seriously burned orchid which still has a good root system, there are quite a lot of chances that orchid will completely bounce back. You just need to have patience because the orchid is severely set back without the leaves. So in the case of severe sunburn, there is no way we can treat it. Even if we cut away what we think is the affected portion of the leaf, the damage might be quite extensive. And in the end, the leaf might just yellow and fall on its own. In this instance, what I like to do is simply let the leaf dry on its own. If I start to cut it, even if the tissue is sick, is not completely healthy, there is still sap. So exposing the sap is an open door for bacteria and fungi. So if we want to cut away the leaf, it's a very good idea to seal it off with cinnamon. But what I prefer to do is just let the leaf dry off on its own until it's completely dried, and then simply remove it. It comes off really easy, and already the orchid created a seal around the breaking point by drying the entirety of this area. So on the orchid, what we'll have left are just the remains of a dry leaf. Being that it's dry, it is not an open door for infection, and it does not allow sap to have direct contact with the air. It will look unsightly for a while, yes, but I prefer unsightly rather than further infection. So depending on the extent of the damage, the orchid might not even feel she has a sunburn, and she will perform and act normally. But if the damage is extensive enough, the orchid can seriously be set back. If leaves are completely affected, you can rest assured that the orchid will experience a slower growth, production of smaller structures, but that falls in the normal category. And all you have to do is just make sure that the orchid receives adequate care, and it's certainly not placed in a position which allows for heat to damage the leaves. Other than that, there is no treatment. There is actually no point in making any treatments if the leaves are not infected. Sunburn is not an infection, it is a physical damage. It can be removed because it doesn't look good, yes, but you need to be careful to seal off the cut wound very well. If you don't mind the damage, you can just let the leaf perform normally or let it dry normally and remove it when it is completely dry. So alrighty guys, hope this video was useful and thank you for suggesting this video. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. If you didn't enjoy it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for regular orchid and plants videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye! So the very pretty blooms that we had this month are coming to an end. Both the Phragmipedium and the beautiful Francis Fox are now on their way out when it comes to blooms. So yeah, I'm afraid you're gonna have a very hard job this month to pick out the orchid of the month. There are so many orchids that were very pretty this month. I'm not even sure which one I like best. Maybe the Francis Fox. But the spotlight videos are not over. Soon we're gonna have quite the really beautiful orchid, so stay tuned for that.